Okay, so turning the page, you'll see picture of some of the individuals later on who lived in this home. The lady in the front right became the this is Harriet Alderman, and she was the wife of, I believe I'm right in saying, Benton Alderman later on. But you see the names there, the Hiltons, the Harmons, adding in some aldermans and a few other names. T.T. Weddle, Tom Weddle, son of Elkanah, is in the center in the back row. He's the father of Edmund, who was the foreman of, he was the father of Edmund, foreman of the building of Topeka's current brick church. We're still now, and will continue to be, in the land of the Goody Koontzes. George Goody Koontz, as I mentioned earlier, shared a boundary line with Isaac Height. He also shared a boundary line with Christopher Slusher. Now, when he came down to this area, purchasing at least 1,200 acres. Now, the word grant, for a time, I thought meant that it was given. But I now understand that the word grant basically meant given the right to survey particular boundary of land. So that as Mike is slowing down here, if you go up that path through that gate and then proceed to your left, you're in the Goody Koontz Cemetery. Now, there are a number of people from this community buried in that cemetery. David and Nancy Slusher are there. Asa and Julia Harmon and their little son Elmer are there, as well as a number of other individuals, including members of the Goody Koontz family, buried in that cemetery. You'll notice that it has pine trees planted there. Alvin Harmon, who lived in the home that was built in the location of the Elijah Hilton house, the home that's standing there now, he had suggested to individuals in the community who saw the little cemeteries being overrun by brambles and briars, he suggested putting pine trees in, thickly planting pine trees in the cemetery. I know that was done in the Goody Koontz Cemetery. I know it was done in the old Topeka Cemetery. That's the reason there are trees there. Also in the Marianne and Burrell Hilton Cemetery, which is just down Reedsville Road. And the logic for him was that the shade would block out the light and keep the brambles and briars from growing. Of course, nowadays, at the old Topeka Cemetery, of course, we're dealing with the limbs that fall and break a headstone, and all of the twigs and branches and the other problems, as well as where are those roots growing. But anyway, we know that Jacob Goody Koontz's father, George Goody Koontz, died before George came to this area. So it was Jacob Goody Koontz, whose father had died when he was 13, and he was the oldest son, so he inherited the patriarchal name and privilege and all that went with it. Okay, so he comes down to this area, builds a house within what his descendants called an Indian fort. Basically, that meant that the house was inside an enclosure. We have the house, a spring, amount of land for a little garden, and then around it, a protection, which, as I said, the grandchildren later called their Indian fort, but really that protection was from Native Americans in the area. In fact, one of the Goody Koontz family stories was that on a cliff right along West Fork here, that there was a Native American, an Indian as he would have been called then, using their language, that the last Indian in the area to be killed in this location or in this area was killed here. And they were fearful of retaliation, so they buried him in the sod or dirt floor within that enclosure. Now that story became that he was buried in the basement of the house that's here now. That's not the case, okay? Even though I still hear people saying, oh, that's the house where there's an Indian buried in the basement. But the stories have gotten conflated to have that as the story. This is the house where, during the Civil War, this was a supply station. That was a well-to-do family. It was already a social center. They had an ice house. That meant that if you had someone who was sick in the summer and they needed some ice to put around to help break the fever, they would go to the Goody Koontzes and get some ice. It was also the place that they would move the furniture out on the porch, and this would be where they would have their dances, their social gatherings. This was a community hub, okay? The picture that you see opposite the Solomon Harmon family home place, this is a picture of that home that was built in 1840. It later became the home of Jacob Alderman, then of his son Benton Alderman, and then eventually the home of Kermit Grimm, and now the home of Kermit's son Mark and his wife Myra Thompson Grimm, who live there now. During the time of the Civil War, to go back to that for a moment, this was the supply station area, which is to say that when a company of soldiers from the area was getting prepared to have to go to the front, in other words, to battle, here was where they gathered in the blankets, the bridles, the saddles, all of the accoutrement that was necessary for supplying a company of soldiers. Also even the livestock, the horses even. So that there came the point where they had just provided the provisions for the young men going to the front, and here come raiders to the home. Now, the raiders were coming thinking that there wouldn't be guns here because they had just sent the men to the front. Well, as it so happened, one of the Goody Koontz girls had married William Bishop. He was a Methodist preacher. He was there with his squirrel gun. He had, and so when these raiders came and were saying, let us in, they were expecting you to just burst right in and take whatever they wanted, as they obviously had been doing in the area, and shot out some of the lower windows, shot through the front door, and the hole is still there in the front door where that ball went through the 2-inch thick front door and landed then eventually, as I understand it, there still may be the evidence of where it made its way through. At any rate, Mr. Bishop shot down into the darkness. They had arrived under cover of darkness and hit one of them in the hip. And he let out such a yelping and yelling and noises that it scared the rest of them, and the group took off. Now it seems that there was at least a dozen or so involved in this group. Well, the next morning they developed or gathered a posse of old men. Why am I saying of old men? That's right, the young men had gone to the front. So the old men followed the tracks over into Will's Ridge, where they find, it was described as being a cave, and within it these men with mattresses and blankets and chickens and eggs and hams and bridles and saddles and all of these things that they had been gathering and pilfering them from smokehouses and, from homes. And these were pretty much deserters, and some of them the ne'er-do-wells who had been able to avoid their going into being conscripted into service. So the posse gathers them up and marches them to Christiansburg. And we know that some of them who were deserters were sent back to the front. The one who had been shot remained in jail for some time. And there was a barn, and I'll show you, well, you can probably see as we're sort of going around the curve, a barn that was there that had within it approximately a dozen horses and sheds around the side for the hay, the grain, etc. Some of that man's friends came back, set it on fire, set a fire around in those outer sheds, such that one of the slaves, Thad Palmer, one of the Goody Koontz slaves, who after the war got 40 acres, and I'll show you where he lived, recounted not being able to forget the screams of the horses being burned alive within that barn. So the Goody Koontz family basically were pretty sure they knew just who had done it, but to my knowledge there was no proof or further action that they were able to take regarding that. Now the building that is to the left of the driveway, directly across from the house, pause right here if you can for a second. You see the stone foundation? That was the foundation for a two-story slave quarters. When Mr. Benton Alderman moved here, he took down the 2 stories, kept the foundation, and built that as his garage for his car or vehicles. And Mark and Myra would be happy for us to even drive down in and below the house, but there are low-hanging apple tree boughs, so we won't do that to scratch up the sides of the bus. Some of you may know the name Doug Spur Road. That was one of the early roads coming through the area. There was the turnpike, the Carroll Floyd Turnpike, and then there was the Doug Spur Road. Now move on up to where they can see the driveway, Mike. We know that their driveway, which if you can imagine it coming down from up there, crossing over and then going down, this driveway is a part of the original Doug Spur Road. Going around in front of the house, going down to West Fork, fording, remember there was no bridge, fording West Fork, and going across. Now, look to your left, there is the large hill, we'll call it, the wooded area. Go down to the right and you see where it forms a division with the next hill, so that you are able to follow, as we said, the path of least resistance. That's where the Doug Spur Road continues up right to the end of the driveway of Alan and Ann Harmon's home. You can actually pause there, look when you're up there down to your right, and you can still see the imprint of the Doug Spur Road coming down. Okay, we can head on out, I think. And as we head out this way, the likelihood is, and from the descriptions that I've read that were written by the Goody Koontz descendants, that first cabin within what they later called the Indian Fort was probably on this side of the house rather than near where we stopped. And you see the kitchen. I think we can pause, maybe we'll keep on going a little bit further so they can tell me when you can see the house and barn. Everybody good to be able to see the house? Okay. This house is like some others that I'm aware of. in that the main part of the house, which would be to your left, has two stairways going to the to the second story. Now, one stairway would go up to the girls' bedroom, the other stairway going up to the boys' bedroom, and there's no connection upstairs between those rooms. So you can imagine where Mom and Dad's bedroom was, so that they're aware that individuals going up this stairway to the girls, the other stairwell to the boys. Now, there have been improvements, so it doesn't look exactly, of course, as it did back in the 1840s and on through Civil War on up through. But that kitchen area was there in the 1840s and Civil War time, and there's a stairwell up to the small second story loft above the kitchen. And that's where Thad Palmer, who was their house slave, had his room. So a third stairwell, but you can't reach any of the parts of the second story from any other part of the second story. You have to go down and go up another staircase. Just briefly about Thad Palmer. Thad Palmer was purchased in Richmond by one of the Goody Koontz sons, who was not at that time married. He had gone to Richmond, obviously for the express purpose of purchasing a slave. And Thad Palmer is said to have recounted that he surely was glad Mr. Goody Koontz purchased him, because he was about to be bought by an old sourpuss. Now, he also proudly shared that he had been purchased for $1,800 gold, and that Mr. Goody Koontz carried that receipt with him in his, I guess you would call it his money purse, or whatever the men would have referred to it, that he carried on his person. And I suppose that if you were a purchased slave, that would be a matter of some pride. He was a teenager, probably around 17, 18 at that time. But he was the trusted slave at the house to take care of all of the building the fires, carrying in the water, taking care of the garden. Sarah Stewart, who was the nanny or granny to the Goody Koontz children, Thad Palmer later married Sarah Stewart. And after the Civil War, they were given 40 acres by the Goody Koontzes, and I'll show you where that begins. And they had 13 children. Sarah passed. He married again, and I believe the correct number was either 5 or 6 more children. And people in the area, the Trail family who lived up the hollow where we had stopped earlier, descendants of that family tell of Mr. Thad always having something in his pocket to give to the children, a wrapped piece of hard candy, something like that, and that he was beloved in the community. I think we can move on now. Of course, the Goody Koontzes valued education, and so their children went to the Harmon school. And I'll give you an indication of where the Harmon school was. But Wells Goody Koontz, in recalling his experience in going to school, said, "Yep, always had to go to school." He was one I can picture as complaining about it. Says, even when it snowed, had to go to school. Said Daddy would, if it was over 10 inches of snow, would hook a log behind the horse and make a path, but we still had to walk to school. So picture him walking probably through path near West Fork Creek, we can imagine, because they would have been crossing over what was then a swinging bridge to get to the Harmon school to go to school. Now, starting about here is the 40 acres from here on your right. From here to West Fork Creek, up to the top of the hill would be the 40 acres given to Thad Palmer. The pictures that you have are taken from the back section of the field, looking down upon the Thad Palmer house. Now, when this land, this is where Mr. Kermit Grimm and his wife Frances Grimm now live. That house we just passed was a tenant house during the alderman's time, and I believe maybe late Goody Koontz time. But this was built by Chester Trail and his wife Esther Bowman Trail. And Kermit Grimm, who lives here now, indicated that, yep, he remembered Chester saying that this was the Thad Palmer place. So Chester Trail, knowing that the land that he owned from here on your right down to West Fork was the 40 acres that had been given to Thad Palmer after the Civil War. This land, the Goody Koontz plantation, is still in the ownership of the Grimm family. Now Kermit Grimm's two sons and daughter variously own portions of it and farm it. And to my knowledge, this farm, approximately 1,200 acres, give or take, is the largest farm to have all of its property joining. You know, the only division is this road that we're on right now, which means you don't have to get all of your equipment and go 10 miles to mow that section and 5 more miles to mow that section. All of the land is joining, and it's because it was all of the Goody Koontz, the original Goody Koontz plantation. Okay, again, picturing the Goody Koontz children walking along the stream on their way to Hilton School. When we get to this intersection up here, if you go down Reedsville Road, cross the second bridge, and look up to your right, you'll be able to see the imprint of the road that would lead you to the Harmon School. Rob, would you share us a little bit about your history with the Harmon School?
At the intersection of Wade and Ferny Creek. What I've been told, it was before my grandparents or great-grandparents moved there, it was a log cabin dating to the 1700s. That chimney is rebuilt into our house now. And of course, when that house was torn down, you were talking about the house. I was there the day they took the chimney down, and they hooked a tractor to it and pulled, and it didn't budge, and they had to rehook the rope, get better leverage. So it was very well constructed. And then when I had my house built around 2007, Mark Cox, I hauled all the rocks over and he rebuilt the chimney. We numbered the hearthstones and some of that stuff and got them put back exactly. But in the cleanup of that, some of those logs we used, and then I just, several years after it had been torn down, probably 3 or 4 years, I flipped over a board and found handwriting on a board in pencil, and it has some names. I don't remember what they were, but you can read the names, and it says the last day of school and then the closing of our school. And I think there's a date there, but I don't remember what it is. I don't know, you may have written that down.
I didn't, but I was going to point to the fact that there is at least a picture in here of some students at the 1907 Harmon School, or students there.
I'm pretty sure one of the names is a Hilton.
Mm-hmm. And that makes sense. Hiltons and Harmons, and I don't have listed here all of the children, but the description of the school, you know, the fact that it was built according to specifications of the time for the one-room schools, 20 by 24 feet, 12-foot high walls, tongue and groove floor, chestnut shingle roof with a 21-inch overhang over the outer walls. Harmon and his influence, his son Jacob S. Harmon, whom we'll talk about in just a couple of minutes, and Jacob S. Harmon's influence more back in this direction as he had a store and a mill, and he was the postmaster, and he also, emphasizing education, was most likely the individual who had seen to the building of what was called the Harmon School. Now, keep in mind that over to your left, we're still talking about the Thad Palmer land, and going down to the stream, and you can see in the distance the home of Daniel and Morgan Grimm, the end of the cornfields there. But and there's home overlooking West Fork as it meanders along below them. So this is still Goody Koontz land with what was given to Thad Palmer, and we'll be coming down in this, as we make the turn in the road, I think you'll be able to look up and see some of the remains of the Thad Palmer house. It's a two-story house. Just this particular little spot, I always think of it as I come by. My husband, DJ Keith, mowed for the highway department in the summers of after his senior year in college, and he said a hailstorm came up, and he was able to pull his tractor, the highway department tractor mowing, in under that rock to get some protection. You know, they didn't have any canopy or anything from the hailstorm. So I always think of that when I see that rock. But right up above this rock cliff, can you see that there are still some remains? The second story has fallen down. But that's the location of the Thad Palmer house. And this picture is a picture of Thad Palmer. And I paired his picture with a picture of Creed Hilton, who we will talk about a little bit later. He was one of the slaves of Elijah Hilton, who did come back to the area after the Civil War, and who was the last person buried in the old Topeka Cemetery. Okay? All right, we can continue. I also had included there, opposite the Harmon School picture, a picture of the home of Mary Ann Slusher, sister to Elizabeth, who married Solomon Harmon, which means she was a daughter of Christopher Slusher. And she married Burl Hilton. They are ancestors of, Donald Hilton and all of their kin. And as we are nearing the next bridge, we will be crossing into the land that was the Slusher property. Now, if you're looking up to the very top of this hill, that's where Daniel Grimm took those color pictures. Now, you're fine. Of looking down this way, and it's up there that the Palmer Cemetery, where Thad and his wife and some of their family are buried, at the very top of the hill at the backside of their 40 acres. Okay, going through this, of course, this isn't first growth timber, but it will give you a sense, okay, this is what they were coming to in the late 1700s, early 1800s. All right, as we cross the bridge here at West Fork, you're into the land that was Christopher Slusher's, and his and/or his children's, all the way to the next bridge. If you know where I grew up, if you know where Kevin and Missy live now, that bridge. All right, Christopher Slusher's land extended from this bridge to that bridge. Another way sort of to get a sense of just how widespread the acreage that these early settlers had. All right, as you turn the page, and you will see a picture of individuals picking beans. The young woman in the forefront on the right page picking beans is picking beans in that field that is to your right. Okay? I see that in just the last couple of days, maybe yesterday, they got these two fields cut. These now are cornfields of Mark and Curtis Sowers. But looking at that picture, look very carefully at the picture in the background, and you can see in the back left the Christopher Slusher barn, and can you see in the very center in the background a white house with a chimney? That's the Christopher Slusher Senior Home, built around somewhere between 1802, 1809, thereabouts. Okay, as we are nearing the location of the Christopher Slusher barn, I don't have it in order, so you have to go over a couple of pages to see an old barn. It was actually located about just above where that tree right there, that older tree with the broken limb. It was up on that knoll. That was the location of the Christopher Slusher barn. Now this barn had its sheds already removed by the time this picture was taken. This would have been a threshing barn, which is to say, you notice that you can look all the way through the barn, so that the doors, the front, doors at the back, you would flail the grain, whether it was the oats or wheat or rye, on the floor of the barn. And when you had flailed the grain out, there still is going to be chaff there. You wouldn't want there to be chaff in with grain when you took it to the mill to be ground into flour. So on a windy day, you would open both the front and the back doors and would go in and with some sort, maybe even hands, be lifting the grain to let the wind blow out the chaff. Now at each of the doors there would be a log, probably a square log holding the door when the wind is blowing, but that would hold that thresh and keep it from going out into the dirt. It was the threshold, which is where we get the name from that we talk about, walking across the threshold, being carried across the threshold. That's the origin of that term. That for a threshing barn, it kept the grain from going out. And so that threshing barn, built by Christopher Slusher, it was interesting that early on, as individuals would come into an area, I made mention of it with the Solomon Harmon house, they would build a small cabin and live in it while they were building their big barn. Did that make sense? For the protection of their cattle, for the storage of not only their own grain for their food, but for their cattle through the winter, etc. And then they would be building a larger house. Now, this house, the upper left portion of this house, 2 rooms down, 2 rooms up, was the portion that was built by Christopher Slusher sometime between 1802 1809, and we don't know exactly. We have records of his being here within the county by 1802, so probably started there, or maybe did have a smaller cabin to start with, though he had brought his children with him, so I'm going to say they probably got busy and were building this house as we see the upper left portion of the house when he arrived here. Upstairs, above the second story, some years back, I think in the 1990s, an architectural archaeologist was invited to go into the home to date it, and he dates it that it had been built by 1810. Okay? Now, if you look closely, you'll see of the upper side that there are 2 windows upstairs and only 1 downstairs. Can you see under the upper window nearing us, can you make out the faint outline that there was a doorway there? Can you tell in the weatherboarding that that is where there had been a doorway, which is to say that was their entrance? Look in the grass. Can you see the stones still that lead right to that doorway. Those were placed there by Christopher Slusher Sr. and his wife, Eva Hancock Slusher. Now, this is the location in 1837 when my great-great-grandfather Jacob Slusher and his wife and their youngest children came to live with Christopher and Eva and care for them because Eva, according to family letter, was ill, and so they came to care for them, and then she passed shortly thereafter, sometime around 1837. And so Jacob and his wife, Talitha Hilton Slusher, and their youngest children stayed here caring for Christopher Sr. until his death in 1845. Okay? Now, back up. Opposite the picture of Glenna Weddle, the girl picking beans, is in the upper picture the house right across the road here. That little house was built 1836. All right, that was the home of Jacob S. Harmon, son of Solomon and Elizabeth, that we talked about the house earlier. Okay, their son Jacob S. Harmon married Sophia Weddle, granddaughter of Benjamin Weddle. Okay? I believe that this is the house they built because it is said they moved down West Fork, approximately 2 miles near Christopher. That fits the bill. And that they lived there until 1845, because then we know that they built on the right side and the other additions to the Christopher house. Now, on the right side of the home, you'll see only has a lower porch. When it was first built, it had an upper and lower porch, which you can also tell by looking above the porch line. You can see where the door that would have come out onto the upper porch. But when the current occupants, Pat Cox AG and her husband Murray AG, did their remodeling of the house when they came to live here, the upper porch's floor, which was quite flat, was in not good condition. So they chose just not to replace that upper porch and to board in the entrance and to have the single porch. On the porch, do you see the little bench, the little log bench? They retrieved that log bench from the Christopher Slusher barn. When the Christopher Slusher barn, they had wanted to restore it. You know, they were in the process. You can see from the picture having removed the sheds and so forth. But we're told that the foundation logs were too far rotted, etc., that it really wasn't something that they could do. So they came home from a trip to have found that during a storm while they were gone, it had succumbed to its age and had fallen. But if you look behind you, those logs that are part of Pat and Murray AG's, that form Pat and Murray AG's garage, those logs are from the Christopher Slusher barn. So they are repurposed. If you look to the right of the house and you see the corner of a rail fence of sorts, that's where the garden that Christopher and then Jacob Harmon, and then Jacob Harmon's son Asa, and then Asa's, we will call him adopted son, though he didn't change his name. And I am going to take just a moment to share with you how did this come to be in the family of Pat Cox and her husband Murray A.G. Okay, I'd early mentioned to you about the Magdalene Daniel Spangler home being a haven, a refuge. Some even maybe, I think, calling it the poor farm. There was an afternoon when a man described as coming from Indian Valley, headed to the poor farm with a little 6-year-old boy named Preston Cox. And it was near dark, and so Asa Harmon and his wife Julia Slusher Harmon invited them to come in for an evening meal and to spend the night, which they did. And the story was that the man was taking Preston Cox to the poor farm. His mother had died. His mother and 4 other women had had children by this one man in Indian Valley. He claimed them and helped to provide for them, but after the death of the mother, he was taken in by a Hilton family in Indian Valley who chose to move to Indiana, and so Preston somehow was not taken to Indiana, and he was being brought to the poor farm. Well, when they woke up the next morning, Asa and Julia said, "Just leave him with us." And so Asa and Julia Harmon raised Preston Cox as their own son. Preston's son was Harmon Cox. Herman's daughter is Pat, who lives here now. So I count her as family, absolutely. And I called her yesterday to let her know we'd be stopping, and she's always happy that anytime anyone wants to come and walk around. You know, I was sharing with you that that little rail fence back there, that's where the garden was and continues to be in that little section. So coming from 1800 whatever to now, some 210 years, it has been a garden there. Okay, Rob asked, do I know where the Jacob Harmon store was? We're sitting on it. Okay, you can see the old roadbed, and the roadbed that still goes around down the creek. We just saw Mark Sowers in his silage truck go in behind us and down, so he's going down to where they're obviously cutting corn. But the old roadbed used to go up just to our right, and according to Pat, she could still remember when remains of the store were right here. Okay? So Jacob S. Harmon in this vicinity became the central gathering place. He had a mill. He had the store. He was partners with Asa Howard with having a mercantile store here. He had a license for a distillery. He had a license for an ordinary. An ordinary meant that you could serve a meal and provide for overnight stay. I'm guessing that that house, his previous home, was possibly, I don't know it for sure, was possibly used for that purpose, knowing that he had a permit for such. In his store was also the post office. It was the Willis Ridge Post Office. And I have his store register where in the upper corner, 1854, name changed to Wills Ridge. Think about it. In cursive, W-I-L-L-I-S looks very much like W-I-L-L apostrophe S. There had been confusion, and for whatever reason then, the ridge, which had been Willis Ridge, the name was changed to Wills Ridge. Now there are other names, other explanations for how it became Wills Ridge. I know of at least 3 more stories of why it was Wills Ridge and not going, but anyway, that'll take another half an hour, which we won't take right now. At any rate, we know that Jacob Harmon, then, being an influential individual in the area, I think he probably wrote letters for people because he was educated. I think he probably loaned money to individuals. This was the gathering place. By the time of his passing, he owned at least 8,500 acres. Now that was scattered. That was not all together. One can imagine that an individual might be in desperate need of money. And if he's a source and can loan the money, and then if it comes due and they can't pay it, the only collateral is the lands. And my guess, and it is a guess, but knowing other situations, my guess would be that that's how he came to have much of the acreage. And there were many families that came into the area to be tenant farmers on Jacob Harmon land. So for Jacob Harmon and his influence in the area, he had a number of children. He had Asa, who got the house after his passing. He had Ananias Harmon, who for our history of Laurel Branch Church was the first elder of the church. He only lived a couple of years after the organization of the church into a separate entity. But Ananias Harmon, son of Jacob Harmon, was the first elder of Laurel Branch Church. Okay, so he also had daughters. Imberzetta and Nancy Harmon were two of them. Those two sisters, all right, Daniel Bowman figures into our history of Laurel Branch Church. Daniel Bowman married Imberzetta Harmon. She died. They had some children. After her death, he married her sister, Nancy Harmon. And so upon the passing of Jacob Harmon, when the settlement of the estate occurred, Daniel Bowman got two sections of the Harmon estate because he had been married to both Imberzetta and Nancy. So that's how Daniel Bowman came to have the land which he and his third wife, Orlena Weddell Harmon, who were parents of Luther Bowman. That's how Orlena and Daniel came to have the land that was given for Laurel Branch Church's meeting house. Okay? So when I said it was Slusher land, you sort of convoluted, but originally, yes. Then coming down to his grandson Jacob Harmon, and then settlement of his estate to Daniel Bowman, who had married two of the daughters, and then he and his third wife giving the land for the church. Now as we come here, we're coming up, and you can turn the page. As you turn, you can see the interior of the Christopher Slusher house. You can see the latch and hinges that are original to the Christopher Slusher house. That door goes from the back room to the front room of the two lower rooms of the house. When you turn the page, that is Mr. Asa Harmon, who had taken in Preston Cox, and you see him holding Preston's son, Herman Cox, father of Pat, who now lives in the house, as well as Lillian Kenley. He and his wife Julia had also taken in Lillian's mother, Cassie Wade, and had raised Cassie. And then eventually Cassie's daughter was raised by Asa and Julia. Let me back up just to tell you very quickly that Asa and Julia had one son, Elmer. And little Elmer died before he was 3. And in the Goody Koontz narrative, the writer of that narrative tells that one of his very first memories was of going to the burial of little Elmer Harmon at the Goody Koontz cemetery and remembering that he looked so pale, was his memory. Now this was like a 6-year-old remembering the burial of a 3-year-old. And that the fact that they then didn't have any other children, they took in Preston, they took in a number of other children as well, at least 3 more children that I am aware of. Now we have stopped, when you turn the page to, we'll skip the cupboard for right now, but let's turn to this picture, which is the original store building built by Julius Dickerson, father of Dexter Dickerson, who is father of the current Julius Dickerson that many of you know. Okay? So this building is the original building that Julius built, the house, the store building, and the barn that stand here. In fact, Hazel Rutrosh shared with me at Church Sunday an article that had appeared and gave the history of the building of these buildings and how it traced on down to eventually get into the hands of Stephen Douglas Bond, S.D. Bond. And he took the top portion off when he purchased it to make it a 2-story store and also side rooms to it. And in my youth, I remember coming with my father when he would be buying chicken feed, and chicken feed in those beautiful feed sacks, and I would get to choose which of the prints or styles or whatever I wanted for my next dress when I came with Dad to buy the chicken feed. It's also here that, you know, those, I would call them the pink pills, that the pink confectionery candy that's about a ½ an inch thick and about the size of a quarter, you know, and I remember sucking on those like to make them last as long as they could, you know, because I knew I'd stretch that out for a long time because, you know, that was few and far between. Okay, this, at the time that picture that's in your notebook was taken, was also the site of the Falcon Post Office. So by that time, it was no longer down at the Harmon store, the Harmon Howard store, but the post office was up here and was called the Falcon Post Office. Turn the page and you will see the very happy postmistress of the Falcon Post Office. She is Texas Sneed Lester, wife of Callahill Lester, and she was the postmistress here at the Falcon Post Office. You also see on the other side there pictures that were taken of the S.D. Bond store. The one above is as it looked in my memory in the 1950s and thereabouts. And then later, after Graydon Bond, S.D. Bond's son, passed in 1969, it was closed. And S.D. Bond is it great-grandfather to Rob?
And the sign, the S.D. Bond sign, I can remember being here, and it's one of my goals to track it down. It's in Danville.
Oh.
What I've been told. There was someone, and Brendan Sam Hancock is who I've got to talk about. There was someone that was kind of raised by someone in the family, maybe S.D. Bond, I'm not sure, but they asked for the sign years ago, and then they said, yeah, you can have it. And so they're still alive, getting older, but in Danville, I've been told. I want to find out from Brendan Sam who it is, and try to go down and at least get a picture of it sometime.
Okay, and Rob is making mention of Brenda Belcher Hancock, who is sister to Rob's mother, Evelyn, and they were children of Ava and Paul Belcher. Ava, daughter of Stephen Douglas, S.D. Bond. So the connection there. That's great. I'm glad you know that, and good luck.